context, our first study this morning really deals with the first few verses. In fact, it's going to be the first 10 verses of the 1st of Kings 13, which is, of course, the chapter about the nameless man of God. But you'll realize from our exhortation yesterday that it really does follow on from the circumstances of the last few verses of 1st of Kings chapter 12. And we remind ourselves in verse 32 of 1 Kings 12 that Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah, and he offered upon the altar. The margin says he went up to the altar. And likewise again in verse 33, he went up upon the altar which he had made. And he did so, says verse 32, in the middle of the verse, that he might in Bethel sacrifice unto the calves that he had made. So clearly what we have is a man who intended not only to set up a rival religion, but a rival system of priesthood, and he fully intended that he would be the high priest of that new order. And this circumstance is all about that advancing of Jeroboam's cause because of his personal ambition, his desire for control and for influence. And it's in that context that the 1st of Kings 13 in verse 1 says, "And behold, there came a man of Judah, a man of God rather, out of Judah, by the word of Yahweh unto Bethel, and Jeroboam stood by the altar." So the very things referred to in verse 32 and verse 33 of the previous chapter about Jeroboam going up to the altar in order to offer is now taken up in this particular chapter. And so effectively the text of 1st of Kings 13 follows on without break from chapter 12. In fact, we might just read it that way. So reading from verse 33 of the 12th chapter, "So he went up upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel. And he went up upon the altar and burned incense. And behold, there came a man of God out of Judah by the word of Yahweh unto Bethel." And Rodham says, "As Jeroboam was standing by the altar." It happened at that very moment of time, brothers and sisters. And by the way, where did the man of God come from? He came out of Judah, the place of true worship, the place of God's true altar. And out of that place, Judah, came this man of God. But notice that we're told that he came by the word of Yahweh. Now that phrase, brothers and sisters, is used about 50 times in the 1st and 2nd of Kings, the word of Yahweh. But it's used 10 times in this one chapter alone. He came by the word of Yahweh. Over and over and over again in this chapter, the man of God will be described as one who comes by the word of God. See, this man was the word of God in action. He came as the representative of God, and he was certainly going to be God's spokesman on this occasion. And he came at the very moment of time that Jeroboam was about to ascend onto the altar to offer sacrifices. It says there, does it not? He stood by the altar to burn incense. He was standing on the ledge or the platform beside the altar, which permitted the priest access to place the sacrifices on the altar's top. He was there to officiate at his counterfeit Feast of Tabernacles. So why that first verse is interesting, brothers and sisters, is that what we're being told is that just as he was about to preside as high priest of the inaugural ceremony of his false worship, God immediately challenged that apostasy. At the very point it began, God intervened. Now, when it says in verse 1 that he was there to burn incense, the Hebrew word can mean either to perfume incense or to smoke a sacrifice. And I think in the context, it's clearly the matter of the turning into smoke of sacrifices that's intended on this occasion, because of the reference in the previous chapter, verse 32. He went to sacrifice unto the calves. And incidentally, well, you know it was a counterfeit Feast of Tabernacles, don't we? 15th day of the month, but a different month. I think he was deliberately copying Solomon. Because if you come back to the 1st of Kings chapter 8, I'm sure that Jeroboam had in mind the greatness of Solomon's reign. He sought to duplicate what Solomon had done, you see, but in his own kingdom to the north. In the 1st of Kings chapter 8 and verse 62, we're told, the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before Yahweh, and Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered unto Yahweh, 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. And so the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of Yahweh. And the same day did the king hallow the middle court that was before the house, for there he offered burnt offerings, meat offerings, the fat of the peace offerings. And verse 65 says he held a great feast, and all Israel with him. And of course that great feast, we believe, in the 1st of Kings chapter 8 was a Feast of Tabernacles. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings at the dedication of the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles. And now Jeroboam's got his own Feast of Tabernacles, and he's about to inaugurate his system of worship. It's a rival system, brothers and sisters, and that's the moment that the man of God appears, right at the beginning of Jeroboam's apostate system. And verse 2 says, and he, the man of God, cried against the altar in the word of Yahweh. And in addressing his denunciation against the altar and crying out against it, the man of God condemned the complete system of worship that Jeroboam sought to establish, because the altar was its focal point. In fact, do you notice how the verse finishes? Upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee. It's all about the altar, brothers and sisters, because this altar was the symbol of the entire corrupt system of worship. And yet in threatening the altar, the man of God was also condemning the builder of that altar, who was, of course, Jeroboam himself, who had constructed this altar in his high place in Bethel. So how would this threatened judgment come about that the man of God had declared? Oh, altar, altar, these things shall come about. Well, he says, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. Now, it's a very interesting verse, the 1st of Kings 13, verse 2, because the very precision of this detail has led some scholars to doubt its authenticity. So precise that the man is named Josiah. People have said, well, that can't be the case, not that far ahead of time. This either is counterfeit or it's a later insertion. It cannot have been there in the record originally. And yet I don't think we've got any reason to doubt the authenticity of the passage, brothers and sisters. In fact, the message is really directly related to the circumstances of Jeroboam's new sanctuary in Bethel. Now just go back to the end of the previous chapter and notice the contextual link to that phrase. 1st of Kings chapter 12 verse 19 says, so Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. Verse 26 says, and Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. And now the man of God will say in chapter 13 verse 2, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David. And you see, what the man of God was really saying is that one day a son of David would stand in Jeroboam's capital and remove his rival system of worship, that God was with the house of David and not with the house of Jeroboam. In fact, it was a prophecy of the ultimate overthrow of Jeremiah's kingdom, the fall of his dynasty, and the triumph of his rival. And who was this one of the house of David who would arise to perform this judgment? Well, says the man of God, his name will be Josiah. And Josiah means whom Yahweh supports. And the naming of the child, even though in advance of his time, was an indication that Yahweh's purpose remained with the house of David and not with the house of Jeroboam. It's quite remarkable when you think about it, this verse 2, because the prophecy of the man of God, here in the 1st of Kings chapter 13, is uttered around about BC 930. But its ultimate fulfillment by Josiah in the 2nd of Kings chapter 23, which we'll come to by and by in our studies, is not until BC 622. In other words, there's a gap between the two of over 300 years. From the moment the man of God prophesies to the moment the judgment finally comes is about 300 years. If ever we needed an illustration, brothers and sisters, of the long suffering of God, here it is. He pronounces judgment, and yet he gave his people time to change, time to reform, time to repent. More than enough time, don't you think? 300 years. But when the judgment came, both the altar and the priesthood associated with it would be utterly destroyed. And the burning of the bones of the priests upon the altar would defile that place. It would desecrate it forever as a place of worship. And what the man of God is really saying here in the 2nd verse is, all has been determined. The time has been fixed. The avenger has been named. God knows all. There's an interesting poem by Henry Longfellow called Retribution, and he puts it this way: though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small. Though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness grinds he all. It's true, brothers and sisters, isn't it? Of all God's judgments, they will come to pass. They will always come to pass. And there will be an exactitude about God's judgments from which there will be no escape. But you see, even though the final fulfillment of this prophecy lay far off in time, there was an immediate proof to the audience of the day, and especially for Jeroboam himself, that all of this would come to pass. And that proof was given by the man of God in the very next verse, 1 Kings 13 verse 3, when it says, and he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign which Yahweh hath spoken. Behold, the altar shall be rent, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. Now, you stop and think about that sign, brothers and sisters. The man of God was clearly unable to make that wonder occur by himself, which, incidentally, is what the word sign means. He gave a wonder, and the wonder was that the altar shall be rent and the ashes poured out. Well, the man of God couldn't make that happen of himself, and yet it was going to occur. And the sign of the shattered altar and the scattered ashes was a vivid proof, when you think about it, of his authenticity as God's spokesman. If this miracle occurred, then who could doubt the final outcome? If the man of God could say, right now you will see the wonder of the broken altar, who would doubt that the final judgment and the birth of Josiah would be true as well? Who would doubt that this altar would one day be destroyed? Now, just picture the scene for a moment, brothers and sisters, the drama of this chapter, the 1st of Kings 13, verses 1, 2, and 3. Because, you see, you realize what's happened is, here's Jeroboam. He's a very, very capable and ambitious man. He's got it all set up the way he wants to. He's about to prosecute his cause. He's probably arrayed, resplendent in the glory of his new priestly regalia. He's about to ascend the altar. He's ready to inaugurate his whole system of worship in a rival feast of tabernacles, in a rival temple, and he a rival priest. And right at the crucial moment, when all eyes are fixed upon the king, a man of God turns up and interrupts the ceremony. He positively ruined Jeroboam's moment of glory. It wasn't a good time to arrive, in a sense, was it, for the man of God? In fact, it was a terribly difficult time for the man of God to arrive. Now, brothers and sisters, would we have marched in on that occasion and at that precise moment forthrightly denounced what was about to happen? Well, of course, we wouldn't, because we weren't the man of God and we weren't asked to do so. But don't you think there's a principle here? I think there's a divine principle at work here that is relevant in all of our lives, and that's the principle of courage. Because you see, stop and think about what really happened here. The man of God showed courage in denouncing the apostasy of Jeroboam and in standing in the king's presence to warn of coming judgments. The man of God didn't know actually what would happen. He couldn't be certain what the outcome was, but he came to offer God's message, and he came in the word of God to do so. You see, this is not the courage of human bravery. It's the courage of godly faith. A faith that burns despite our fears. The man of God marched in with no doubt his heart in his mouth and interrupted Jeroboam in the very proceedings. "Oh, altar, altar," he says. And the whole ceremony stopped dead, just like that. And isn't that what Elijah did in the 1st of Kings chapter 21, verses 20 to 24, when it says that he was prepared to condemn Ahab for the death of Naboth and for his great wickedness in leading Israel astray? After all, if the king had been able to secure the death of Naboth, well then wasn't Elijah's own life at risk if he was to condemn the king for his great wickedness at that time? Elijah couldn't be certain of what the outcome would be, and yet he forthrightly condemned him for the wickedness that he'd shown. And isn't one of the greatest, most remarkable moments of courage in the Bible story the moment in Esther chapter 4, verses 15 to 17, when Mordecai says to Esther, you must petition the king on behalf of your people. We're in danger. And Esther showed such tremendous courage in entering into the presence of Ahasuerus and taking her life in her hands to plead the cause of her people. You just did not approach the king in such a way at such a time without authority. And remember those words of Esther? If I die, she says. But she did it anyway. Courage to stand for the truth. And wasn't that the spirit of John Baptist in Mark 6, verses 16 to 20, when Herod spoke to him and he condemned Herod for his marriage to Herodias? He says, it's wrong, what you've done is wrong, it's unscriptural. And he declared its unlawful state without compromise. We know what Herodias was like. She got his head in the end. But a man of God showed courage. And you know, brothers and sisters, none of us will probably be faced in such circumstances as any of these. We're not the man of God or Elijah or Esther or John Baptist. We're probably not going to face a situation as difficult or as traumatic as that. But there are moments in our life where we ought to say something for the truth. And the question is whether we'll have the courage at that moment to do so. It doesn't matter whether it's a thing great or small. Will we have the courage to say what's right for the truth when that moment arrives in our lives? I think it's good that we remember this, brothers and sisters, because we live in an age where the default position is it's probably wrong, but let's not say anything about it. That's not the spirit of the man of God. And it probably shouldn't be our spirit either. Saying nothing about things when they're clearly wrong is probably the means by which we facilitate its growth. So the record says, well, picture the scene, brothers and sisters. Jeroboam's standing on the altar ledge. He's about to offer. He's interrupted. Can you imagine how Jeroboam the king felt? He was positively furious at this rebuke. And standing in his elevated position, he dramatically points with his hand to the man of God, as verse 4 says, "It came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar in Bethel, that he put forth his hand from the altar." He clearly was there with the sacrifices. He took his hand off the sacrifice, and he pointed his hand, he put forth his hand, saying, "Lay hold on him." He dramatically pointed to the man of God, as the king might rightly do. Green's literal says, he put out his hand from the altar saying, "Seize him." Or as the New King James Version says, he stretched out his hand from the altar saying, "Arrest him." Well, what a dramatic moment it was, brothers and sisters. The man of God rebukes, the king turns around, and he puts his hand out and he says, "Arrest that man." And he suddenly finds that he can't move his hand. It's dried up. He can't move it in or out. He can't move it up or down. It's positively frozen in paralysis. And everyone can see the tug of his shoulder, but he can't move it. He can't move the hand in any direction. Ooh, that was interesting, brothers and sisters. Do you know why? Because come back to the book of Leviticus in chapter 21. Now hold your hands in Kings, because we'll come back ever so soon. But in Leviticus chapter 21, in the laws concerning priesthood, we're told this little but vital piece of information. Leviticus 21 says, and verse 17 says, and note this concerns the high priest himself. "Speak unto Aaron, saying, Whosoever he be of thy seed in their generations that hath any blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach. A blind man, or a lame, or he that hath a flat nose, or anything superfluous, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed." One version says a crippled hand. The Revised Standard Version says an injured hand. Verse 21 goes on to say, "No man that hath a blemish of any of these things of the seed of Aaron the priest shall come nigh to offer the offerings of Yahweh made by fire. He hath a blemish. He shall not come nigh to offer the bread of his God." And so the law of Moses was absolutely explicit. If a man had a damaged hand in any way, he was disqualified as a priest from being able to offer offerings on an altar. And Jeroboam's paralyzed hand made it impossible for him to fulfill the service of priesthood the law of Moses now forbade him. Oh, what a punishment that was at that precise moment of time, that in the providence of God he was disqualified from being able to officiate at his very own ceremony. So coming back to the first of Kings, chapter 13, the record says, verse 5, that the altar also was rent, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of Yahweh. Now, that word rent there in verse 5, the altar also was rent, means literally to split asunder. So it's quite a powerful word, to rend apart. So here's the king standing on the ledge next to the altar, and suddenly there's this grinding noise, and then this terrible sharp sound of the altar splitting apart, and as it does so, all the ashes pour out the bottom. But you see that word ashes? That word ashes really refers not just to ashes, but to both the ashes and the fat of the sacrifices. It's a reference to the fatty ashes of the sacrifice after they've been burned upon the altar. Now, hold your hand in the 1st of Kings 13 and come to the book of Psalms in chapter 20, because here's the same word, brothers and sisters, and in a context which perhaps helps with the interpretation of the meaning. We're told in Psalm 20 these words, verse 1, Yahweh, hear thee in the day of trouble. Name of the God of Jacob, defend thee. Send thee help from the sanctuary and strengthen thee out of Zion. May that God who might help us do this, says Psalm 20, verse 3. Might he remember all thine offerings and accept thy burnt sacrifice. But the margin says, turn to ashes or make fat, you see. And the turning to ashes and making fat of the sacrifices indicated God's approval of them. May God remember thy offerings and turn them to ashes and fat in acceptation. But here in the 1st of Kings chapter 13 and verse 5, the pouring out of the ashes to the ground showed that these sacrifices had not been accepted by God. And given that this was probably the inaugural ceremony of Jeroboam's priesthood, what we're being told is that God rejected those things immediately, without hesitation. Now here's the king, brothers and sisters, in full view of this matter, and suddenly the rending of the altar occurs, his hand is paralyzed, and this succession of events must have absolutely shocked him. Do you think there was any thought at this moment of time that Jeroboam might kill the man of God? No, Jeroboam's attention has been somewhat diverted by his own predicament, has it not? You see, God moved to protect his man. There'd be no judicial execution on this day. All the people are watching the king. What's he going to do? And the problem is, Jeroboam can't do anything. He can't take command of the moment. In fact, all he could do was to ask for help. So he says in verse 6, the king answered and said unto the man of God, entreat now the face of Yahweh thy God and pray for me. Oh, notice that request, brothers and sisters. You see, he wanted the man of God to pray. Pray for me. Now, let me show you why that's interesting. But a couple of references, one in the Old, one in the New. Prayer. If you come to Psalm 134, in one of those songs of degrees, we read these words in Psalm 134, verses 1 and 2. It says there, behold, Psalm 134, verse 1, behold, bless ye Yahweh, all ye servants of Yahweh, which by night stand in the house of Yahweh. Who's that, brothers and sisters? Who stands in the house of God? That's the priests, isn't it? It's a reference to the priests of Israel who stood in the sanctuary, the servants of the Lord. And what might these servants do, verse 2? Lift up your hands in the sanctuary and bless Yahweh. Well, that's what the priests did. They offered blessing in prayer. But you see, when a priest blessed, as we all know, brothers and sisters, from both Old and New Testament, what the priest did is he lifted up his hands. He lifted up to bless. And I think the margin's quite possibly correct when instead of saying, lift up your hands in the sanctuary, it says, lift up your hands in holiness. That the very act of prayer was a matter in which those priests ought to be holy in their thinking as they lifted up their hands in holiness to petition God. And now come to the 1st of Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8, and you'll hear the Bible echo. And this is really where it does come from, doesn't it? This is perhaps why Paul says what he does say in the 1st of Timothy in chapter 2 concerning matters of ecclesial life. In the New Testament, he says in verse 8, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting. See, prayer is the ultimate form of worship, and it's used here as a symbol of the matters pertaining to worship. The men hold the priestly role. As the Diaglott says, I appoint therefore the men to pray in every place, lifting up holy hands without wrath and disputing. So the holy hands of Psalm 134 are the same holy hands with which the brethren in ecclesial life ought to exercise that priestly function of prayer, lift up the hands in holy prayer. But you see the point, brothers and sisters. The man of the 1st of Kings chapter 13, the king, left stranded on his ledge, can't pray because he can't lift his hands. One hand is paralyzed. He can neither offer sacrifice nor offer prayer. Oh, do you notice something else back in the 1st of Kings 13 verse 6? You notice that the king doesn't appeal to his golden calves to heal him. Now he asks the man of God to pray. And he seeks the power of the God of the man of God. Not the golden calves. Pray for me, he says. I entreat thee, entreat now the face of Yahweh thy God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored again. And it says, brothers and sisters, and marvelously so, the man of God besought Yahweh, and the king's hand was restored him again, and became as it was before. Now, it's an interesting word, that word besought. The man of God besought. In fact, it's the same word that the king used when he says, entreat the face of the Lord. In the Hebrew, it's two words. It's chala panim, which really means, literally, to stroke the face. But it's a Hebrew expression meaning to stroke the face so as to soften it by intercession. Please soften the face of God on my behalf, cries the king to the man of God. And that's what the man of God does. It says the man of God besought Yahweh. Rotherham says, and rightly so, so the man of God appeased the face of Yahweh. That's exactly what he did in this prayer of intercession for this man. So what we've got, brothers and sisters, is the man of God prayed for the man who'd ordered him to be arrested. But he prayed because he sought Jeroboam's reformation, not his ruin. And his prayer was sufficient to bring about the restoration of the king's hand. The mercy of God was seen. And healing came because of the power of prayer offered for the need of someone who had opposed him. That's an interesting spirit, isn't it, for us to contemplate, brothers and sisters. Healing came because of the power of prayer offered for the need of someone who had opposed him. And so Jeroboam had been dramatically stopped, had he not? In the very moment of his sin. You see, here was a chance to repent, a chance to confess, a chance to change, a chance to turn back. So would Jeroboam choose to step away from his folly or harden his will to continue? Well, it was the matter of free will that God has always given to all of us, brothers and sisters, in all the circumstances of our lives. He grants free will for us to choose. But with free will, he brings also the law of consequences. So the king's hand was restored. I'm sure Jeroboam felt greatly relieved. It was a difficult moment in his life, shall we say. And as a result, the king says, verse 7, he said unto the man of God, come home with me and refresh thyself, and I will give thee a reward. Now, to offer refreshment to a guest was an Abrahamic thing, wasn't it? Genesis 18, verse 5. The patriarch had offered refreshment to guests. But it was actually also a custom of the day to honour a prophet with a gift if he performed a service. If you come back to the 1st of Samuel chapter 9, you'll remember just a few days ago in our daily readings, the record says, when Saul was searching for the asses of his father, and they came near the city of Samuel, we're told in in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 7, that Saul said to his servant, "But behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the vessel is spent and the bread spent in our vessels, and there's not a present to bring to the man of God. What have we?" And the servant answered Saul again and said, "Behold, I have here at hand the fourth part of a shekel of silver. That will I give to the man of God to tell us our way." It was customary in those days to honour a prophet with a gift if some service was sought or requested of that one. Isn't that the same as the 2nd of Kings chapter 5 and verse 15, where Naaman urges Elisha that he might receive a gift in return for a service performed? It was the custom of the day. Now, it might be in 1 of Kings 13 verse 7, it might have been that Jeroboam had a more sinister or devious motive to neutralize the message of the man of God, to minimize his effect by seeking association with him. It could have been that he was saying, "Well, why don't you come home with me?" And then he could say to everyone afterwards, "Look, it all turned out really well. In fact, we had a meal together, you see." But I don't think that that was the spirit of Jeroboam on this occasion. I think given the drama of his deliverance and the power of the man of God's prayers, I think he really did want to show hospitality. He really did want to reward the man of God for the miracle of his healing. But here's the tragedy, brothers and sisters. His thankfulness did not lie in being shown the way of sin in his life. He was thankful for a lucky escape from a physical affliction that might have disabled him, but he didn't want to confront sin. He was prepared to refresh and even to reward, but he wasn't ready to reform or to repent. Well, in any event, and despite his offer of hospitality, we're told that the man of God said unto the king, verse 8, "If thou wilt give me half thine house, I will not go in with thee, neither will I eat bread nor drink water in this place." So you see, the man of God was very clear about God's charge upon him. He's still on his mission, and he was resolute in his performance of that mission. He showed faithfulness in making his refusal clear. And notice, brothers and sisters, verse 8, it's not just the king's house. No, he said, "I won't eat bread or drink water in this place." It was Bethel in its entirety that he would not eat and drink in, because of this was the place of Jeroboam's apostasy. "I can't eat anywhere in this place, let alone the king's house," he says. And so if Jeroboam thought that the attitude of the man of God had changed in his favor after his prayer of intercession for him, well, then he was mistaken. The man of God had been honorable and merciful in responding, but his loyalty was to God and not to the king. And that's the thing, you see, brothers and sisters, that's where our loyalty should lie. We ought always to be merciful and respectful to others, but our loyalty lies to God. There was an occasion once of a matter of controversy which Brother Roberts was dealing with, and Brother Thomas wrote to him and said, "You ought to deal with this matter." And Brother Roberts wrote back and said, "I'm just trying to give these erring brethren the benefit of the doubt." And Brother Thomas wrote back and said, "You must always give the benefit of the doubt to the truth and not to the erring. Give the benefit of doubt to the truth." There's a lesson there, brothers and sisters. Our loyalty is to God, ultimately, and to God's requirements. In fact, he says, does the man of God, verse 9, "For so it was charged me by the word of Yahweh, saying, Eat no bread, nor drink water, nor turn again by the same way that thou camest." Of course, you know why all this happened, brothers and sisters. We shan't turn them up, but Daniel 1 verse 8, Hosea 9 verse 3, Luke 5 verse 30, you know that to the Jew, to eat and to drink was an act of fellowship. I can't eat and drink, he says, because that would be an act of fellowship. And you see, God abhorred idolatry, and this prohibition upon his messenger was to teach Jeroboam that he, the king, had no fellowship with God, that he was out of fellowship with God. The man of God here represents God. I cannot break bread with you because you're not in fellowship. Which begs the question, brothers and sisters, whether we uphold the principles of fellowship as we ought to do biblically. There are those whom we ought to receive into fellowship. That's an apostolic teaching. And there are those whom we ought not to receive or to retain in fellowship. That's an apostolic teaching. And whether we uphold the principles of fellowship will in measure to decide whether we also are the men and women of God. But this man of God was absolutely clear. I can't break bread with you, he says. In fact, he says at the end of the verse that the instruction that God had given him was that he was not to turn again by the same way that he came. Now that's an interesting thought, but I think the suggestion is that he was not to give any impression whatsoever of frequenting the land of the kingdom of Israel. Whichever way he arrived into Bethel, he was asked to take a different direction on the way out, so that no one could force or delay his departure, and he couldn't be followed and brought back to Bethel. He was to complete his commission and then depart without any further contact with anyone else. And the thing is that he told the king all of those things without prevarication. So what we're presented with here is indeed a man of faith and a man of courage who told the king exactly what God had instructed him to do. And not only did he say that God asked him to do it, but he did do it, because verse 10 says, so he went another way and returned not by the way that he came to Bethel. He fulfilled his commission as God had asked him. So his arrival, his prediction, his departure were all unique moments designed to symbolize divine intervention, but not fellowship. His exit from the scene was just as significant as his arrival. Who would have dared to walk in and behave in such a way before the king? He appeared out of nowhere, he delivered his warning, and now he was going to vanish without trace. In fact, when you think about it, brothers and sisters, verse 10, his message was going to be given in what framework? In what context? Well, he was going to deliver it, brothers and sisters, as a stranger, just in transit. The man of God was a sojourner, just passing through. And that's our status as well, isn't it, really, when you think about it? You see, in Genesis chapter 23, it's Abraham who says, I'm a stranger and a sojourner with you. And David knew that, because David in the first of Chronicles 29 verse 15 quotes the words of Abraham. He says, we're strangers before thee and sojourners as all our fathers were. And again in the book of Psalms, Psalm 39 verse 12, hear my prayer, O Yahweh, and give ear unto my cry, for I am a stranger with thee and a sojourner. That was the status of the fathers of old. And the first of Peter chapter 2 and verse 11 says, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts. And in that passage in the first of Peter chapter 2, the two Greek words for strangers and pilgrims are the two Greek words in the Septuagint of Genesis chapter 23. Peter's quoting from Abraham as well. You see, we don't belong here, brothers and sisters. We don't have any permanent citizenship here. We're just strangers passing through. Which, by the way, has a whole lot of implications for our life and our ecclesial life. That's why we don't vote. That's why we don't go to war. That's why we don't seek legal redress. Those are all matters in the doctrines to be rejected in the statement of faith, are they not? It's part of our pilgrim status. It's also, incidentally, why we ought not to organise social welfare activities to solve the problems of this present cosmos. We don't belong to this world. We're not in charge of solving this world's problems. We're separate from it. We wait for a world to come. Our citizenship is not here and now. Now, the reason why I mention that, brothers and sisters, is because some of the activities taking place in the ecclesial world today are not only a contradiction of the Spirit, but damage our position as conscientious objectors. When our argument has always been that we will not fight for this present world because we're just strangers passing through, and suddenly we're busy, involved in all the activities of this present world to solve this world's problems, which we have not been called upon to do biblically. We've got to be careful, brothers and sisters, what it means to be a sojourner. The man of God was. He was just a stranger passing through. And there's an associated principle here, you see, and that's this. It's to do with the witness of separation. You see, the man of God refused the offer of the king of Israel, and he maintained separation from one whose apostasy he was about to denounce. But isn't that what Abraham did in Genesis 14, verses 21 to 24? He refused the goods of the king of Sodom, and he maintained separation from one whose wickedness he was about to rebuke. I cannot accept it, says Abraham, not from thee. And isn't that what Daniel did in Daniel chapter 5, verses 16 and 17? He refused the reward of the king of Babylon. Let thy gifts be to thyself. He maintained separation from one whose pride he was about to judge. And isn't that what Peter did in Acts chapter 8, verses 20 to 22? Peter refused the money of the sorcerer of Samaria, and he maintained separation from one whose avarice he was about to condemn. And you see, the lesson, brothers and sisters, of this principle is that separation is essential for effective witness. We cannot testify against an evil and corrupt world if we're deeply embedded in the same way of life. The real force of the message of the man of God lay in the fact that he clearly did not belong to the order of things he came to speak against. He was absolutely separate from it. He arrived, he disappeared. Now, Christ has asked us to be in the world, but not of it. And the man of God is an illustration of what that looks like and feels like. It involves courage and commitment and passion and persistence, but in all God's men and women, that's the spirit that they've shown in their generations. Now, I know we've got to live in the world, brothers and sisters, I understand that, but there's a balance here between living in the world and being fully engaged in the very activities we're supposed to be witnessing against. So here's the principle. When separation is lost, so also is witness. We have to find how that works in our lives. Well, what a dramatic arrival of the man of God upon the scene in the first of Kings chapter 13. And what a dramatic meeting and what a dramatic message from the man of God when at the very start of the crisis of Jeroboam's apostasy, he came and he said, "O altar, altar, thus saith Yahweh," and he pronounced those dramatic words of judgment. The question is, of course, would he be heard? Would his mission succeed? Well, that, brothers and sisters, is the subject of our study tomorrow.